Once I finished with Python, all I knew, oddly enough, is that I wanted to do something with Connie Booth. We were married at the time. And I didn't know what, but I went and talked to Jimmy Gilbert, who was the head of Light Entertainment, and I said, I'd like to do something with Connie. And he said, fine, we'll go, come back with an idea. And I went back and I said to Connie, they'd like us to do a pilot. What shall we do? And we spent about 20 minutes deciding we couldn't do the sort of Mike Nichols, Elaine May stuff, because that had been done and also very well done by the two Johns and Eleanor Bron. And then I said, what about that hotel we'd stayed in? Because when Connie'd been occasionally doing parts in Fawlty Towers, she'd come down to Torquay and she had stayed at this amazing hotel run by Mr. Sinclair, and it was called the Glen Eagles Hotel. He was the rudest man I've ever met. He was wonderful, and all the other Pythons wouldn't put up with it. They moved out and went to stay in the Imperial, which was a lot better. And he was so extraordinarily rude. I mean, one day we were all at dinner, and Terry Gilliam was eating as Americans do. That is to say, they cut the meat like this, and then they cut it all up, and then they put the knife there, pick the fork up in the right hand, and spear the meat. And he was walking by, and he looked down at Terry, and this look of astonishment across his face, and he said, "We don't eat like that in this country," he said. And on another occasion, Eric Idle left his briefcase by the front door in the morning, because we'd had to wait for the cab and he forgot it. And then in the evening he got back, he said, "I left my briefcase." Mr. Sinclair said, "Yes, it's the far side of the wall." And Eric looked out at the main entrance where he was pointing, and there was the swimming pool, the far side of the swimming pool, there was a wall. And he said, "Well, you mean the other side of the he said, what? He said, Eric said, "Well, what do you think, why did you put it there?" And Sinclair said, we thought it might be a bomb." And Eric was astounded, because this was pre-69, pre the resumption of the IRA bombing. And Eric said, "Well, why a bomb?" And Mr. Sinclair said, "Well, we've had some staff problems recently." So he thought somebody was coming back to blow up his hotel. So this extraordinary man was very, very big in my memory and Connie's. And within a very short time, we'd figured out that was where we wanted to set the hotel. But the interesting thing is, nobody thought it was a good idea. All the expert advice we got was, well, he's going to be very claustrophobic in the hotel, you must try and get outside. And when we wrote the first script, there's a famous memo which the current head of Light Entertainment has on the wall of his office, saying that this is a very boring situation, and the script has nothing but very cliched characters, and I cannot see anything but a disaster if we go ahead with it. That's on the wall. And a great friend of mine, Ian Johnston, who helped me write Fierce Creatures, heard three producers at the bar say, "Oh dear, have you seen this new script, Cleese? Oh, it's terrible. Why did he ever leave Monty Python?" So it's kind of fascinating that when you try and do something new, as William Goldman, the screenwriter, says, nobody knows. Nobody ever knows whether it's going to work or not. I loved the first series of Fawlty Towers. It was one of the most exciting times of my life, because it was as though someone had opened the gate to a field of flowers that no one had picked before, and you were able to sort of gambol through the gate, and there were flowers everywhere. We'd entered a new territory, and it was as though almost everything we thought of for about a year seemed or felt original. There was no immediate positive critical reaction. I think the Daily Mirror said Long John short on jokes after the second episode, and one of the Edinburgh papers said it was very poor. And then there was a sort of a rumble of fairly positive reaction towards the end. And then the second, when they repeated it for the second time, that's when suddenly it started to take off. But my experience has always been that if you do something that is original, it takes a little time for any kind of momentum to build up. And in fact, that's a terrible problem this day. In fact, that's a terrible problem these days with movies, because if you don't score in that first week, there's another movie coming in and they take you out. So there's no time for a movie to sit in a cinema anymore and get an audience. And that means that original stuff it's at a disadvantage. Because I once said to a marketing man, "What's the hardest type of movie to sell?" And he said, "Anything original." Connie and I had no idea that it was going to have the impact that it did. I mean, I always assumed it might pick up half the Python audience. And of course, the Python audience was not that huge. It was rather smart, because it was very much the comedy of ideas. But Fawlty Towers was much more a comedy of emotion, and more people were able to plug into it. So as far as I remember, we got quite substantially bigger audience figures than Python. But we had no idea. We were just writing this little thing that we thought was funny. And when you hear years later that it is liked all over the world, there's a kind of puzzlement about why it traveled. And I guess that the reason it travels is that the characters are in some way archetypes. They're the types who crop up in all the different cultures. But I have to say there's a slightly different reaction in this country from what there is in other countries. In this country, a certain number of people assume that I must be Basil. They do not see that this is a kind of a performance. They forget that Connie wrote it with me. They kind of think that I wrote it and I just wrote myself and I performed myself. This doesn't happen in other countries. In America, for example, people accept that it was a bit of writing and performing like any other performance. And I think it's because I caught something about the British character that was so essential to a certain kind of lower middle class conglomeration of attitudes that it struck home and caused me to be identified with this wretched character, this awful man, ever since. I've always had a tremendous love for farce. And I think it's because what I like to do more than anything else is to really laugh. You don't do it so much as you get older, but in your teenage years, there are some times when you just laugh and you laugh so much that it hurts and you wish you could stop laughing. Wonderful feeling. You don't get that so much as you get older, although you get it a little bit on stage. Like as a kid, you get it in church because it's kind of forbidden, and that gives it an extra sweetness. Similarly, on stage, if somebody breaks you up, that business about trying not to laugh, that gives it a certain sweetness, and it can become almost convulsive again. There was an extraordinary emotional reaction we used to have when we used to think of things that would happen to Basil. Because in a sense, we were like gods playing with this man's life. And sometimes when we would think of what would happen next, we would howl with laughter. And then we would think, oh, poor man, you know? Because as somebody pointed out years ago, comedy is very like tragedy. It's just a question of whether you're sympathetic to the people who are suffering or whether you're standing back a bit and laughing at them. Henri Bergson said, comedy requires a momentary anesthesia of the heart. You have to be a little bit cool towards the people that you're watching, even if there's a fundamental affection, before you can laugh at them. Otherwise, all you do is, oh, poor man, oh, terrible. But we had that double reaction. We'd laughed first, and then we would feel sorry for him. Great comedy is always about things happening on different levels, because people say that comedy is about conflict, and people often think that means that character A has got to be head-to-head with character B. But the interesting conflicts are within people when something has happened which is absolutely terrible, but they're having to pretend that it's fine. But if you see them just thinking it's terrible, it's not funny. It's the fact they have to keep up the act. So any time that someone is doing something at one level and something almost contradictory in conflict with it is happening at another level, it's funny. But the thing about farce is that how do you think how to put this? The thing about farce is that everything is happening in an exaggerated way. That although you may start it quite low-key and quite real, it kind of winds up and people get more and more frantic. They may be trying to keep the frantic feelings in and try and present some sort of calm facade to someone they have to impress. But you know that inside they're like this. And what I love is the intensity of the emotion, because with that comes more frantic behavior, more energy, and the possibility of huge laughs. I mean, I think the best evenings of my life have almost all been spent at the National Theatre when they do farces, like the Fado farces. So what a lot of people haven't spotted is that Fawlty Towers are just little 30-minute farces that start very, very low-key and finish up absolutely frantic.